It is the 25th of December, 1776, Christmas night. The wind is screaming across the Delaware River like a living thing, like something ancient and merciless, as if the sky itself has decided that this experiment called America should perish in the cold and the dark and be forgotten. The river is black, the river is churning. Massive plates of jagged ice, some as wide as a wagon, are grinding against each other in the current, cracking and groaning with a sound like distant cannon fire. Sleet is falling sideways. The temperature has dropped so far below freezing that men's eyelashes are stiffening with ice. The New Jersey shore, barely 300 yards away across that killing water, is invisible in the storm. And yet, on the Pennsylvania bank of the Delaware River, in the howling darkness, 9,000 desperate men are waiting for one man's decision, one man's will, one man who has lost almost every battle he has fought for the past 6 months, one man who is about to do something so audacious, so mathematically improbable, so recklessly brave that history will spend the next 2 centuries trying to understand how he found the nerve to order it. His name is George Washington, and tonight he is going to save America. But to understand why this night matters, to understand why this crossing of a frozen river on Christmas night 1776 was the single most important military decision in American history, you have to go back. You have to go back to the summer of that same year, to a time when the revolution was young and bright and full of fire, when ordinary farmers and blacksmiths and schoolteachers picked up muskets and truly believed, that they could stand against the greatest military power on earth. You have to understand what was lost in the months before Christmas. You have to feel the weight of those losses before you can understand the miracle of what came after. In the summer of 1776, the mood in the American colonies was electric. The Declaration of Independence had just been signed in Philadelphia, and the words that Thomas Jefferson had written, those astonishing, world-shaking words about self-evident truths and unalienable rights in governments deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, those words were being read aloud in town squares from Massachusetts to Georgia. People wept when they heard them. People cheered. People fired muskets into the air in celebration. There was a sense, intoxicating and almost delirious, that history was bending, that the arc of the world was changing direction, that something new and magnificent was being born on this continent. Washington himself, reading the Declaration to his troops assembled on the New York Commons, felt it. He believed in it. He had left his comfortable life at Mount Vernon, left his farms and his family and his books, because he believed in it with every fiber of his considerable being. But belief, as Washington was about to learn, does not stop musket balls, and the British were coming. In late August of 1776, the largest military expedition in British history arrived off the coast of New York. The scale of it was almost incomprehensible to the Americans watching from shore. More than 400 ships, 32,000 soldiers, professional soldiers, trained soldiers, soldiers who had fought in European wars and knew exactly what they were doing. Among them were 8,000 Hessian mercenaries from the German principalities, soldiers for hire whose discipline and ferocity had made them feared across the continent of Europe. Their commander was General William Howe, an experienced and able officer who possessed something that Washington desperately lacked: a fully equipped, professionally trained, lavishly supplied army with unquestioned naval superiority. Washington's Continental Army, by contrast, was a patchwork collection of volunteers, men from different colonies with different weapons, different training, different ideas about what they were doing there and how long they planned to stay. Many of them had never fired a weapon in anger. Most of them had never seen a professional army in battle formation. None of them were ready for what was coming. The Battle of Long Island, fought in late August 1776, was a catastrophe. The British outmaneuvered Washington's forces completely, flanking them through a pass that Washington had left virtually unguarded. In a single morning, more than 1,000 American soldiers were killed or captured. The survivors fell back in disarray to Brooklyn Heights, pinned against the East River with no way out, surrounded by the most powerful military force in the Western Hemisphere. It should have been the end. By every logical military calculation, Washington should have surrendered his army right there and saved his men's lives. Instead, in an act of quiet genius that history has not celebrated nearly enough, he waited for a providential fog, a thick impenetrable maritime fog that rolled in off the harbor, and evacuated his entire army across the East River in the dead of night, in complete silence, without the British having any idea what was happening until it was done. 9,000 men, their cannons, their horses, their equipment, all of it whisked across the water in a few hours of blessed darkness. It was one of the great escapes in military history, but it was still a retreat. What followed was a disaster of a different kind, a disaster that unfolded slowly over weeks and months as Washington's army fell back again and again before the British advance. They were driven off Manhattan. They retreated across New Jersey. Fort Washington fell with nearly 3,000 Americans captured in a single blow. Fort Lee fell. The army marched shuffled really, because marching implies something more orderly, through the autumn mud of New Jersey, hungry and cold and increasingly convinced that they were going to lose. Men deserted by the hundreds, enlistments expired and men simply walked home. Why shouldn't they? The British were winning. The British kept winning. And the Hessians, those terrifying German soldiers, were coming closer every day. By December of 1776, Washington's army had shrunk from nearly 20,000 men to fewer than 3,000 who could be counted on to fight. 3,000, against an empire. The British, watching this collapse with something approaching contempt, had grown so confident of victory that General Howe had simply stopped campaigning for the winter, a standard European military practice, and settled his troops into comfortable quarters across New Jersey. The Hessians, under their commander Colonel Johann Rall, were garrisoned at Trenton, a small river town on the New Jersey side of the Delaware. They were celebrating Christmas. They had every reason to feel secure. The river was virtually impassable. Washington's army was disintegrating. The rebellion, by every measure that a reasonable professional military man could apply, was effectively over. Thomas Paine, who had been marching with Washington's retreating army through the mud of New Jersey, watching the disaster unfold up close, sat down by a campfire in those dark December days and wrote what became the most famous pamphlet of the American Revolution. "These are the times that try men's souls," he wrote. "The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." Washington ordered Paine's words read aloud to every regiment. He needed his men to feel what Paine felt, that this darkness, this terrible winter darkness, was not the end, that something was still possible, that the soul of a nation, even in its worst moment, even when defeat seems absolute and surrender seems inevitable, can refuse to die. And in George Washington's mind, something was taking shape. Washington was not, and he would have been the first to admit it, a military genius in the way that Napoleon was a military genius, or that Frederick the Great was a military genius. He had made serious mistakes in the campaigns of 1776. He had been outmaneuvered and outgeneraled by the British on more than one occasion. But Washington possessed something that no military textbook can teach and no military academy can manufacture. He possessed, in extraordinary measure, the ability to hold himself together when everything around him was falling apart. He possessed the kind of moral courage, not physical courage, though he had plenty of that too, but moral courage, the courage of decision in the face of catastrophe, that separates commanders who are merely brave from commanders who are genuinely great. And in those desperate December days, with his army dissolving around him, with the revolution's flame guttering in the winter wind, Washington made a decision. He was going to attack. Not defend, not retreat further, not wait for spring and hope that something changed. He was going to take whatever was left of his army, cross the Delaware River in the dead of winter, and strike the Hessian garrison at Trenton while the enemy was celebrating Christmas and expecting nothing. It was, on its face, almost insane. The river was running with ice. The weather was ferocious. His men were exhausted and underfed and poorly equipped. Some of them literally had no shoes and would leave bloody footprints in the snow as they marched. His officers doubted the plan. Some of them thought it was suicide. But Washington's logic, while brutal, was clear. If he did nothing, the army would dissolve by January. The enlistments would expire. The men would go home. The revolution would end not with a dramatic battle, but with a slow, cold, quiet fading away. So if he was going to lose either way, he might as well try something extraordinary. If it worked, it could change everything. The plan required several columns crossing at different points simultaneously, a complex operation under the best of conditions, and these were the worst conditions imaginable. The crossing at Trenton itself, the main assault, would be led by Washington personally, with roughly 2,400 men and 18 cannon. Two other crossings, one to the south, one slightly below Trenton, were supposed to happen at the same time, cutting off the Hessians' retreat and trapping them completely. Everything depended on coordination and timing. Everything depended on the river. And everything nearly failed before it even began. The regiment responsible for the boats, the famous Marblehead fishermen from Massachusetts, commanded by Colonel John Glover, the same men who had rowed Washington's army across the East River in the fog after Long Island, began moving the troops and artillery to the water's edge as darkness fell on Christmas night. The river was worse than anyone had anticipated. The ice was not a thin skim on the surface. It was a moving, grinding, churning mass of plates, some of them 2 feet thick, being driven downstream by the current with terrifying force. Men pushing the Durham boats, heavy, flat-bottomed cargo boats, some of them 60 feet long, had to fight the current and dodge the ice flows simultaneously. Loading the cannons was a nightmare. Each cannon weighed hundreds of pounds, and getting them aboard the pitching boats without capsizing in the freezing water required skill and strength, and a degree of desperate determination that transcended ordinary human endurance. Washington himself was at the crossing, watching, urging, commanding. He had been up since before dawn. He would not sleep until the following night. There are accounts of him that night by his officers, by ordinary soldiers who saw him, that paint a portrait of almost uncanny composure, not cheerfulness. Washington was too intelligent and too honest with himself for false cheerfulness, but composure, steadiness. The absolute refusal to allow the men around him to see fear, even though fear would have been entirely reasonable. He rode along the riverbank, he checked on the boats, he encouraged the men, he waited. The original plan called for the crossing to be complete by midnight, with the march to Trenton timed to arrive in the pre-dawn darkness. But midnight came and went, and the crossing was barely half done. The ice, the current, the weight of the cannon, everything was slower than planned. By the time the last men and the last artillery were across the river, it was nearly 3 in the morning. The assault would not arrive at Trenton in the pre-dawn darkness. They would arrive in daylight. The element of complete surprise, the most essential element of the entire plan, seemed to be slipping away. And then Washington learned that the other 2 crossings had failed. The river was too dangerous. The other columns had turned back. His force, these 2,400 exhausted men with their 18 cannon, was alone. There would be no southern column to cut off the Hessian retreat. There would be no trap. It would be a direct assault on a garrison town, outnumbered with no flanking support in broad daylight, after a night of brutal river crossing that had left every man soaking wet and half frozen. Washington did not turn back. He ordered the march to begin. The 9 miles from the crossing point to Trenton were, by any measure, among the most brutal miles that any American soldiers would ever walk. The sleet that had been falling all night was now mixed with snow. The wind was driving both horizontally into the men's faces. The road, if it could be called a road, this rutted, muddy track through the New Jersey countryside, was a sheet of ice. Men slipped and fell. Men helped each other up. Men whose feet were wrapped in rags left dark stains on the white snow with every step and kept walking. Frostbite was taking fingers and toes. Artillery horses stumbled on the ice and had to be righted by teams of men using their last reserves of strength. Washington rode among them on horseback, which in those conditions was its own act of physical courage, and his presence, his simple visible presence at the front of the column, kept the march moving when nothing else could have. 2 men died during that march. They froze to death on the road to Trenton. Their names were Thomas Turner and an unidentified soldier listed in the records simply as a soldier. History has not preserved enough of the story of those 2 men. They deserve to be remembered. They gave everything. They crossed a river of ice on Christmas night in a storm, half-starved and frostbitten, marching toward an enemy they had every reason to believe would kill them, and they died on the road before they even reached the battle. They were the cost of this miracle. They should not be forgotten. Washington divided his force as they approached Trenton, sending one column under General Greene down the Pennington Road to attack from the north, while he accompanied Sullivan's column down the River Road to hit from the west. The Hessians, despite the stories that have sometimes been told, were not drunk from Christmas celebrations. They were, however, fatigued. They had been on high alert for weeks, constantly worried about an American attack, but the river had seemed to extinguish that fear. On Christmas night, Colonel Rahl, their commander, had played chess and drunk wine, as was his custom, but he was a professional soldier and his garrison was on a reasonable state of readiness. What he had not accounted for was the absolute impossibility, in his professional military judgment, of Washington crossing that river in those conditions. The river was his security. The river was supposed to be his wall. At approximately 8 in the morning on December 26, 1776, 2 American cannon opened fire on the Hessian outposts at the northern edge of Trenton. It was the signal. Both columns lunged forward simultaneously. The battle that followed lasted roughly 45 minutes, that is all. 45 minutes that changed the course of the American Revolution and perhaps the course of the world. The Hessians were good soldiers. They were professional soldiers, but they were utterly unprepared for the shock of artillery fire pouring into their positions from 2 directions at once in a snowstorm at 8 in the morning on December 26. They scrambled from their quarters, trying to form up in the streets, trying to load their muskets with frozen fingers, trying to make sense of what was happening. The American artillery, commanded by a young 21-year-old artillery officer named Alexander Hamilton, who would one day be Washington's Secretary of the Treasury and the architect of American financial power, but who today was just a young man firing cannon into the streets of a New Jersey town. The American artillery was devastating. It controlled the main streets completely. Every time the Hessians tried to form up, they were swept with canister shot. Colonel Rahl himself rushed into the streets, trying to rally his men, shouting orders, attempting to organize a counterattack. He was hit twice by musket balls, once through each side of his torso, and fell from his horse. His men carried him into a nearby church where he lay dying. He was 50-year-old, a veteran soldier who had fought in a dozen campaigns across Europe. and in the last hour of his life in a small church in a New Jersey river town, he was beat. When Washington later came to see him, because Washington did come, because Washington was the kind of man who came to see a dying enemy commander and treat him with the dignity that a soldier deserves, Rahl was barely conscious. He died that afternoon. The battle was over in those 45 minutes. Nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers were captured. 2 were killed in the fighting and 3 more died of wounds. 22 were wounded. On the American side, among those 2,400 men who had crossed that impossible river in that impossible storm and marched 9 miles in the dark through a blizzard, not a single man died in battle. Not one. Those 2 soldiers who froze to death on the march were the only American dead of that entire operation. It was not just a victory. It was a miracle wrapped in military precision, executed by a man who should not have attempted it and soldiers who should not have survived it. But the story does not end at Trenton. Because Washington, having crossed the river once and won a victory that staggered the British High Command, now had to decide what to do with it. He could take his prisoners and his captured cannon and retreat back across the Delaware. That would have been the safe choice. That would have been the militarily conservative choice. He could point to Trenton as proof that his army could fight and use the morale boost to rebuild through the winter. That would have been enough. That would have satisfied most men in his position. Washington decided it was not enough. Within days, he was back across the Delaware, back in New Jersey, gambling again. The British responded by sending Lord Cornwallis, one of their best generals, with a large force to destroy Washington's army once and for all. Cornwallis moved fast. He cornered Washington at Trenton with a force that substantially outnumbered the Americans, and on the night of January 2, 1777, he was so confident that he had Washington trapped that he told his officers they would bag the fox in the morning. He was so certain of victory that he decided not to attack that evening, to wait until dawn and finish it cleanly. It was one of the costliest military decisions in British history. Washington that same night did something extraordinary again. He left his campfires burning, left them blazing, left men to tend them and make noise to make the British pickets believe the entire American army was still in camp. And then with his men wrapped in rags around their boots to muffle the sound of their footsteps on the frozen ground, he slipped his entire army around Cornwallis's flank and marched north, not retreating, moving north toward Princeton, where the British had another garrison, where Washington intended to strike again. The Battle of Princeton, fought on January 3, 1777, was another American victory. When Cornwallis heard the cannon fire from Princeton, he understood with nauseating clarity what had happened. Washington was not in front of him. Washington was behind him, destroying his supply lines and his communications and his satellite garrisons. The fox had not been bagged. The fox had walked around the hunter in the dark, in the snow, without making a sound. The British fell back. They abandoned most of New Jersey, the Hessian garrisons that had seemed 10 days earlier like permanent occupying forces in a conquered territory. They pulled back to the coast. The revolution, which had seemed to be dying of a slow winter hemorrhage, was suddenly, astonishingly, magnificently alive. And in the capitals of Europe, something happened that would prove to be the revolution's ultimate salvation. In Paris, in the salons and the ministries and the court of King Louis XVI, men in powdered wigs and silk coats sat up and paid attention. France had been watching the American Revolution with cautious interest. France had its own long grievances against Britain, but as long as the Americans seemed to be losing, there was no reason to risk a major war by supporting them openly. Helping a losing cause is not policy, it's suicide. But Trenton and Princeton changed the calculation. They proved that Washington's army was not simply disintegrating. They proved that this war was not over. They proved that there was something worth betting on. Within the year, France would begin moving toward open support of the American cause. Within 2 years, France would be in the war as America's ally. And without French money, French ships, and French soldiers, without the French fleet that would eventually trap Cornwallis at Yorktown, the revolution almost certainly cannot be won. It all flows from Christmas night, 1776. It all flows from one man's decision to cross a river that could not be crossed. But I want to come back before we end to the men, because the history of the revolution is so often told as the story of the founders, those extraordinary, brilliant, complicated men in Philadelphia and Boston and Williamsburg who wrote the documents and made the speeches and forged the ideas. And they were extraordinary. Their contributions were real and lasting, and we should honor them. But the story of that Christmas night is not primarily the story of George Washington, though he was remarkable. It is the story of an 18-year-old farmer from Maryland who had never been more than 20 miles from home and who crossed a black river in a blizzard because someone he trusted told him it mattered. It is the story of a fisherman from Marblehead who guided a Durham boat through grinding ice in the dark, using skills learned in the North Atlantic fishing grounds, using those skills to navigate history. It is the story of a soldier with no shoes who wrapped his feet in rags and marched 9 miles through the snow and fought a battle and won it, and could not have explained, If you asked him, the geopolitical implications of what he had done could only have told you that he was cold and he was tired and he was still here and he was going home when it was over. These men, the majority of them young, many of them illiterate, most of them poor, all of them cold, these men made a choice on Christmas night 1776 that their cause was worth the crossing, not because they were sure it would work, not because they had any guarantee of victory or survival, but because in the deepest, simplest, most human sense, they had decided that some things are worth the attempt even when the odds are against you, that some principles are worth defending even in the dark, that some rivers have to be crossed, even when the current is running against you and the ice could kill you and the other shore is invisible in the storm. The British Empire at its height covered a quarter of the Earth's surface. It commanded the most powerful navy in the world. It had armies that had beat Napoleon's generals and conquered subcontinent after subcontinent. And on Christmas night 1776, a few thousand half-frozen American volunteers with rags on their feet crossed a frozen river and punched a hole through that empire that was never fully repaired. History remembers the date. History remembers the painting, Emanuel Lutzy's famous 1851 painting, Washington crossing the Delaware, that image of Washington standing upright in the bow of a boat, his officers around him, the flag behind him, the ice-choked river ahead. Though the painting is historically inaccurate in almost every detail, the boats are wrong, the flag is wrong, Washington would never have stood like that in a moving boat in a storm. But the painting captures something true anyway. It captures the posture of a man who has decided, who has chosen, who is not turning back. There is something in that image, something in that forward-leaning stance against the storm that speaks to something permanent in the human spirit, the refusal to accept defeat as final, the insistence that the night is not forever, that the other shore exists even when you cannot see it. Washington would fight for 5 more years after Trenton. There would be more defeats, terrible defeats, Valley Forge, the Conway Cabal, the traitor Benedict Arnold. There would be freezing winters and burning summers and battles lost, and soldiers dead in moments when the whole enterprise seemed again to be on the edge of collapse. But something had changed after that Christmas crossing. Something had shifted in the understanding of what this army was and what it was capable of. Something had been proven, not to the British, though it had certainly been proven to them, but to the Americans themselves. They had proven it to themselves. They could do the impossible thing. They had done it once. They could do it again. And they did. In October of 1781, at Yorktown, Virginia, with the French fleet blocking the harbor and Washington's combined American and French army surrounding the British fortifications, General Cornwallis surrendered. The man who had been so certain he would bag the fox at Trenton, who had gone to sleep confident on that January night and woken to the sound of cannon at Princeton, Cornwallis surrendered his sword. The legend says that the British band, as the soldiers marched out to stack their arms, played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." The world turned upside down. That was what it felt like. That was what it was. But the world had begun turning upside down 5 years earlier, on a freezing Christmas night on a black river churning with ice, when 9,000 men waited for one man to decide whether it was possible. When George Washington looked at the Delaware River, looked at the ice and the current and the storm and the darkness and the impossible odds, and decided that all of that was precisely the reason to attempt it. Because if he could cross a river that could not be crossed on a night when no sane commander would attempt it, his men would know forever what they were capable of. And knowing what you are capable of changes everything. He gave the order. The boats pushed off from the Pennsylvania shore. And America, refusing to die, crossed to the other side.